Once again, an oil company finds itself in the hot seat. The Calgary-based company Enbridge is facing a barrage of questions after its pipeline leaked into the Kalamazoo River in Michigan. John Larsen says oil companies don't always handle the spotlight very well. Every week this summer, we're sitting down with John to talk about corporate culture. He's a principal with Corpin Group, a PR firm in Calgary that specializes in corporate crisis management. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Kirk.
So, what do you think of how Enbridge is handling this incident?
Well, I think, first of all, let's acknowledge that when things like this happen, there is a bit of a siege mentality. It's let's pile on every company and look at them very, very critically from every perspective. And I think that's happening again. But I think we have to judge every company separately in terms of what they're doing. And on the whole, I would say Enbridge has been doing a relatively decent job since this happened a few days ago. The CEO, number one, has been on site. The language that they've been using has been a language of responsibility. They continue to pile resources onto it. So, early days yet, but generally pretty good.
And you were talking about how people really pile on. One of the things that's really hit Enbridge on this is, of course, they have another project that they're trying to get built, another pipeline across Alberta and through BC to the West Coast. And now environmentalists are jumping on that, saying, you can't have this pipeline. Look, they can't take care of the pipelines that they have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it all comes down to asset value. What does this mean for the company in terms of the bottom line financially? The pipeline that we're talking about, the one that ruptured, is quite old. They've acknowledged that. There have been several leaks on it. They've acknowledged that as well. So one of the things that's going to happen as this conversation evolves is people are going to say, what was your due diligence on this? And how can you show us that you did, the proper maintenance that we consider to be acceptable? That's going to be the thing, the judgment that hangs out there in the days and weeks ahead.
It seems like Enbridge is also paying the price for a much bigger spill, that being the BP oil leak in the Gulf. How is Enbridge responding to the comparisons it's now getting to BP?
Well, generally, I think they've learned a lot of lessons from BP. I mean, if we go across the board and we take all the things that BP did wrong, the top 3 or 4, I think Enbridge has done the opposite of that. We just talked about it here in the previous question. I would just continue to say, look, we're two different companies. We operate with different philosophies, and we're going to prove that to you. Again, the outrider is going to be a couple of weeks down the road when people look at the maintenance records and what did they actually know about this before they walked into it.
How well do oil companies generally communicate with the public?
Not as well as they should, and not as well as they could either. I think a lot of the big oil companies feel that they're besieged by public opinion. If they're not consumer-facing, they oftentimes tend to back off that kind of conversation, and that's not a healthy thing. I mean, one of the arguments out there is that people don't understand the industry enough, and if they don't, then I think these companies need to engage at a higher level and more frequently. It's incredibly difficult. One would argue it's almost impossible to tell your story in a positive way when you're in a crisis situation. So that conversation needs to be had at different times in different ways on a more ongoing basis.
Do they almost have to look to their opponents in a way, because environmental groups, industry opponents are always front and center and available to the media, yet the oil companies, often say nothing, Do they need to maybe look to their opponents?
Well, I think they need to look at what the messaging is coming out of these environmental groups. I mean, one of the things that has happened with environmental groups is they have assumed the moral high ground on this discourse. And that's a function of a whole lot of things, not the least of which is that for the last 20 or 30 years, on the whole, oil companies probably didn't do enough to keep ahead of public opinion. They are doing some great things now. That story is being entirely lost because, as I say, the narrative has been misappropriated, and now we certainly know that there's misinformation out there. So I think what they need to do is they need to be very proactive about addressing that misinformation and not sitting back and hiding and just trying to get away from it all.
What role does the media play in all of this?
The media plays a very important role. I mean, certainly the media are not there to be advocates for any companies. They're not there to be their apologists either. What they need to do is to represent the facts on both sides. But in order to do that, we need to see some of these CEOs come out of their boardrooms and come down and actually have those kinds of earnest conversations with the public.
Does the media overblow these types of incidents?
The media can. I mean, I think, it depends. We said before, it depends on what kind of company it is in terms of how they react to it. It also depends on what kind of media agency it is in terms of how they represent the facts. But again, if the environmental groups are getting out in front of this, and if they got the moral high ground, and if they got the emotional language, they're going to get more cut of the message out there.
John, always good to talk to you.
Fantastic. Thank you.
John Larsen is a principal with Corpin Group. It's a PR firm in Calgary that specializes in corporate crisis management.